Hello, today we're going to talk about modal verbs. What are the most common modal verbs? Well, I recommend you to memorize these verbs in pairs. Can, could, may, might, must, should, will, and would. Of course, there are additional modal verbs such as shall, ought to, had better, need to, and have to. And in this video, we'll also talk about the first three in this additional list. Before I give you examples about these modal verbs and how to use them, let me give you three special rules. Modals are a different category of verbs because there are three things that they don't do, that other verbs do, but they don't do. For example, one of them is the S. Modal verbs don't need the extra S for the third person. Let's take a very standard verb, work. You say I work, you work, he works. But for modal verbs, that's not the case. Another example is have. You say I have, you have, he has. You see there's a change in the third person, he, she, it. But with modal verbs, that's not the case. You say I must, you must, he must. The verb doesn't change. Even in third person, in present, it doesn't change. Another rule about modal verbs is that they don't need auxiliaries. You don't need an auxiliary for the interrogative form or the negative form. For example, let's take the verb work again. If you want to make a question with the verb work, you need to use an auxiliary. For example, do or does. Do I work? Do you work? Does he work? Well, with modal verbs, you don't need auxiliaries. Let's take the modal verb should. You simply say should I, should you, should he. As you can see, no auxiliary is necessary. Also, in the negative form, you don't need auxiliaries. For example, again, let's take the verb work. You say I don't work, you don't work, he doesn't work. You need do, you need don't, and doesn't. With the modal verbs, you don't need that. If you want to express a negative modal verb, you simply add not, and you can even use the contraction, which is the most common. And for example, you say I shouldn't, you mustn't, you won't. You can also say I should not, you must not, you will not. The important thing here is that you don't need auxiliaries. And the third special rule is that when you put together a modal verb with another verb, you don't need an infinitive or a gerund, which is very common with standard verbs. With standard verbs, if you have a verb and then another verb, the second verb will very probably need to be an infinitive or gerund. That's not the case with the modal verbs. Let's take a look at these examples. When you use the verb like, you say I like to eat. To eat is an infinitive. But when you use modal verbs, you just say I must eat. You should eat, he could eat. A very common mistake is to say something like I must to eat. That would be wrong. Modal verbs don't need the infinitive. Same thing with the gerund. You say he enjoys cooking. Then if you want to use the verb cook with modal verbs, it's I should cook. You might cook. You don't say I should cooking. So remember, the second verb in this case after a modal verb doesn't change. You don't need an infinitive. You don't need gerund. So after seeing these three rules and these three special rules that modal verbs don't follow, let's take a look at some examples. Let's start with the modal verb can. As you know, this verb expresses ability. For example, you can say, I can speak English. Of course I can speak English. You can also say, you can't read with your eyes closed. No one can't do that. You can't read with your eyes closed. Or you can ask the question, can he ride a bike? Yes, he can, or no, he can't. So affirmative, negative, interrogative, that's how you use the verb can when you want to talk about abilities. Then let's go to the verb could, and I'm going to explain the verb could with might because they are very, very similar. Could and might are very similar. You use these two modal verbs when you want to talk about possibilities, either option A or option B, and you explore what can we do, A or B. For example, we could have sushi for lunch. That's an option. You can also use modal verbs in a negative form. These modal verbs in a negative form, like they couldn't finish the project on time, like it was impossible for them. This is like expressing an idea in the past, which is a topic for another video. You gotta check it out. They couldn't finish the project on time. Or you can also use the interrogative form, could you lend me your charger, which is also a way to express a very polite question. Could you lend me your charger? You can also use it for requests, for polite requests. And what about might? Well, you can say instead of we could have sushi for lunch, you can say we might have sushi for lunch. That works. They couldn't finish the project on time. They might not finish the project on time. that works. You can change and use the verb might and still works grammatically, but you cannot say, you cannot use might for requests. You cannot say, might you lend me your charger? That doesn't work. Let's also keep in mind that there's a slight different meanings when you say they couldn't finish the project on time. It means that in the past they couldn't finish the project on time. For example, yesterday they couldn't finish the project on time. By the time it was needed, they couldn't finish. And when you say they might not finish the project on time, the meaning is different. You're trying to say that there is a possibility that they do not finish the project on time. Now the modal verb may, which is super famous because it is one of the first verbs you learn when you're studying English, because it is the verb for permission. May I come in? May I go to the restroom? May I speak Spanish? This is one of the verbs you first learn, especially for permission. You can also obviously use it in the affirmative way. When you ask the teacher if you may eat in the classroom, the teacher might say, you may eat in the classroom, no problem. And of course, you can also use the interrogative form. You may not use your cell phone in this class. You have probably heard that sometimes we use can for permissions. To be honest, it's not really that big of a problem. It's not really a problem, but I strongly recommend you to use may for permission. If you want to use permission, use may. Now, the modal verb must. This verb is used for obligations. What are some of the obligations we adults have? Well, I must go to work. Students, you must study every day. That is something that is not an option, right? So you have an authority figure saying, this is what you have to do. You must do this or you must not do that. For example, you must not be late to class. And of course, you can also use it in the interrogative way. Grammatically speaking, you can say, must I buy a car? As in, do I have the obligation to buy a new car? However, that doesn't really sound that good. I strongly recommend you to maybe, instead of using must for questions, use should or have to. That sounds much more natural. Should I buy a new car? As in, is it recommendable for me to get a new car? Or do I have to buy a new car? As in, is it an obligation for me to buy a new car? That sounds much more natural. Now, should. Should, very common modal verb for recommendations. Normally a good friend is gonna talk to you and say, you should go out more often, or I should save more money. These are recommendations you exchange in a friendly way. And of course, in the negative form, you just add not or the contraction shouldn't. In this case, I shouldn't go to bed late. It's not recommendable. He shouldn't be so impatient, as in it's not recommendable that he's so impatient. And of course, you have the interrogative form. Should I call you back? Do you think that's a good idea? Is it recommendable? Should I call you back? He might need a raise, so should he talk to his boss? You can also use should in the interrogative form, and it works well. Now, the future. What is the modal verb for the future? Will. This is a future that is not necessarily set in stone, alright? It's a future possibility. I will buy a new house. Yeah, it's there in the future. I will buy a new house. However, if you know for sure that you're gonna buy a new house because you already have the money, the paperwork, you already found the place that you wanna buy, it's better to use going to, which is more appropriate for plans that are very likely gonna happen. Like, I am going to buy a new house. That means that it's super possible. I will buy a new house just means that, yes, sure, there's a chance that I buy a new house. She won't have more kids. That's the negative form of will. You can say will not, or simply won't, which is the most common. Will you get a new job? I don't know, because you have a job that probably you're not happy with right now. So I ask, will you get a new job in the future? Yes, it's not set in stone. There's no specific deadline because we cannot predict the future. Then would. Would is a very interesting verb because it has a couple of uses. The most common, well, is the hypothetical. You say something like, I would like to travel to Japan. Hypothetically, that would be awesome. She would be very happy. If a series of things happened, she would be very happy. Hypothetical. Negative, he wouldn't like to work overtime. Just 8 hours, no more. He wouldn't like to work overtime. That's it. Or you wouldn't do that. For example, if you were the president, you wouldn't do that. Would you like more cake? As a question, would you like more cake? It's also polite, and it's like an offer. Would you have another child? In this case, that's not an offer. It's simply a hypothetical question. Would you have another child? So as you can see, when we use would, we are kind of dreaming. It's like, I would do this, I would do that. Hypothetical. but still you play, right, with the options. And now I want you to pay special attention to 3 of these sentences because they have something interesting to analyze. First, she would be very happy. As you can see, this sentence needs a little bit more context. So that is because, unlike I would like to travel to Japan, which is simply stated wish, I would like to travel to Japan. Yes, sure, I would love to do that. That's it. You don't need more information. This sentence needs more context. She would be very happy. She would be very happy about what? Or what else can you tell me about this? So it is recommendable that whenever you use hypothetical situations like this, you add context. If she finished her master's. This is what we call second conditionals. There's also a video specifically for conditionals. Take a look at this one. You wouldn't do that. Sure, that works, but I think we need more context. So as I was saying before, if you were the president. If you were the president, you wouldn't do that. Hypothetically, again, because you're not the president. Would you have another child if you were in your 30s? Let's pretend for a moment we're talking to somebody in her 40s or 50s. Excellent. And now we have more modals. As I said in the beginning, we're also gonna talk about 3 additional modals: shall, ought to, and had better. These are very common modals, as you will see in a moment, but they have rules. But more than that, I want you to pay attention to how to use them, because yes, there are rules and you can follow the rules and be grammatically correct and accurate, but still some things don't work in real life. So I'm gonna tell you not just the rules, but how to use them. Let's start with shall. Shall is very common for invitations. Shall we go now? Like you're presenting an option and suggesting, shall we go now? Like, don't you think it's a good idea to go now? Or shall we dance? No one does that anymore, but in the past, a man would go and ask a lady, shall we dance? It's a polite way to ask someone to dance with you. Not that it's wrong, it's not very common anymore, but it's not wrong, it's very polite. The negative form of shall is shan't. That's a contraction, and it also talks about a future possibility. We shan't be back by Friday. According to my calculations, we shan't be back by Friday. Or I already explained the rules, or I already explained the procedure to do something, so you shan't have any problem with that. Again, future possibility, you shan't have any problem with that. It's very possible. And the affirmative form, I shall talk to him tomorrow morning. So as you can see, shall is kind of a very close relative of will, but it's also, since it is also used for invitations or suggestions, it can also be used instead of should in a more polite way. Finally, you can also say, we shall watch that movie this weekend, as a future possibility. As you can see, it's not very common to use shall for the negative form or the affirmative form. I just recommend you to use it mostly for invitations. Shall we do this? Shall we do that? In the interrogative way. If you want to use shall in a negative form, maybe it's more common to simply use will in the negative form, right? We won't be back by Friday, or you won't have any problem with that. It's still polite, it's still accurate, and it's more natural. Same, if you're gonna use shall for affirmative sentences, it's better to use will. For example, I will talk to him tomorrow morning, or I am going to watch that movie this weekend. It's a plan, I'm absolutely sure. It sounds better. If you still want to ask people to do something in a polite way, shall is a nice verb to use. Now let's talk about ought to. Ought to is a modal verb that some people might say it's in the middle of should and must. It's not as intense as must in the level of obligation, but it is slightly more intense than should. It's a recommendation similar to should, but a little bit stronger. And you're presenting an idea to someone with more security. Instead of saying simply they should get a new job, you can say they oughta get a new job. And it's a little bit more confident and a little bit more firm. I oughta talk to the manager. It's not an obligation like I must, but it is a strong recommendation. I oughta talk to the manager. The negative form can also be used. If you want to say that someone shouldn't stay in bed, you say you ought not to stay in bed, or I ought not to spend all my money. Notice that you don't use a contraction with ought, alright? You don't say, I don't know, just as shouldn't, you don't say oughtn't. That doesn't work, that doesn't exist. You can also use the interrogative form. Ought you to do more exercise? Ought they to be more punctual? That also works in the interrogative form. However, Even though this is the grammatical structure to follow, ought to, it's more commonly used in the affirmative way. If you want to express a negative recommendation, it's better to simply say you shouldn't stay in bed. Or if it is a little bit stronger recommendation, maybe you can go all the way to use have to and say, I don't have to spend all my money. That's not an obligation. I don't have to do that. Same way for the interrogative form. You don't really hear many people using ought to in the interrogative way. So you can just do the same and instead use have to. For example, do you have to do more exercise? Or should they be more punctual? That sounds more natural. It's mostly used when you want to emphasize what's right and what's wrong. And as you notice, many times in American English, it is pronounced as oughta. They oughta get a new job, or I oughta talk to the manager. Finally, we have had better. Had better is used for strong obligations, and it is very commonly contracted to apostrophe D, better. So you don't really hear people saying you had better study for the exam. You will hear you'd better study for the exam. You'd better study. Super common expression. I'm sure you've heard that. I'd better hurry. Like, oops, it's so late. I'd better hurry. Very common expression, and you never say really I had better hurry. You say I'd better hurry. Now, what is the negative form of had better? Well, you simply put not after the word better. For example, I'd better not fail any class. You can see the intensity here. It's stronger than must. It is almost like a life or death situation. He'd better not forget about the appointment. He'd better not forget about it. You can also use the interrogative way. Had I better clean my room? Had you better go to work? So, as you can see, there is a level of intensity in these expressions with had better, so don't use it lightly, alright? Really save it for very special situations. And similar to the last modal verbs, you don't really use the interrogative way. It's not very common. It's better to go to have to if you want to emphasize the obligation. Do I have to clean my room? Or should you go to work if it is not such a strong thing that you want to emphasize. You can use had better, of course, for affirmative and negative ideas because they express obligations, as I said before, they express obligations much more strong. So as a summary, what are the most common modal verbs? Well, can, could and might, may, must, should, will and would. And of course the three additional modal verbs that we saw today, shall, oughta and had better. Thank you, that's it for today, and remember, practice makes perfect.